Most of us get stuck in our thinking brains, and all of our universe is a function of us running our tapes and listening to our dumb mind. If you're going to be a leader, start right away learning the techniques of mapping the mental terrain. Once you decide that here's the new pattern that I want, then you have to ask, what kind of mindset do I need to have to produce that sort of pattern?
Hello, I'm Rick Amy. As a leader, once you know that you can change the way you think, how specifically do you make the changes that will accomplish what you want at the office and at home? The incentive to modify yourself is that you may transform your life. In this next conversation with leadership expert Jim Farr at his farm near Greensboro, North Carolina, he outlines a method for reprogramming yourself.
Well, once you decide that here's the new pattern that I want, then you have to ask, what kind of mindset do I need to have to produce that sort of pattern? You know, for example, I may find that whenever so-and-so is around, I act in a suspicious, untrusting way. That's how I handle, and it interferes with our relationship. And I decide that I want this to be in an open and supportive relationship. So now I have to stop that behavior which he reacts to as unsupportive and untrusting, and generate a new one. So I figure out how I want that to be. What kind of behavior should I engage in? How should I react to you? And then, instead of saying, okay, what kind of mind program do I need? What I do is I sit down and deliberately do that. Now, if it's really interfering with my personality, all kinds of difficulties come up, and then I can focus on handling those difficulties. Or if it doesn't cause difficulties, then I just have to focus on doing it enough so that it becomes an incorporated habit. Where this usually comes up is people are running their lives with certain chronic problems that keep occurring, or chronic difficulties in relationships or whatever, that they want to get rid of. Well, let's take, they lose their temper. They don't have enough control of their temper. They don't know why, or they don't know how it happens. It just happens. What they need to start doing is running some correlations, noticing the characteristics of the conditions where they lose their temper. And from that, they can make inferences as to what belief is triggering the sense of threat that they're reacting to with anger.
Now, how technically does someone do this? Do they just simply do, as the actors do, develop a third eye, kind of look down on themselves and observe and then write this out?
In some cases, they do that. In other cases, they may need counseling, to somebody to point out that, you know, you always do this when you're with an older man. And you're not aware of that. That there's something that triggers an older man. You know, and a typical example could be an executive who gets promoted who's quite young and has to supervise a bunch of senior, more experienced managers who would have internal insecurity and shyness about telling older, smart, intelligent older folks what to do, and might not even know that. So he's too diffident in his leadership, he's not controlling and assertive and definite enough. And or, in the model I was using, something in that may cause him to get angry. But he doesn't know what it is. At that point, I might be able to say to him, notice when this happens. And he begins to notice, well, it happened with that one, and that one, but not those three. What's the difference in them? They're older and they're younger. Ultimately, he can catch on that I have some kind of reaction to older people that causes me to feel threatened, and I react with anger.
Would the leader be able to self-correct? At
that point, the leader can then say, oh, now that I know, next time I'm going to talk to those people, I will not get angry. Now, the anger may come up, but I will not act it out and I will not show it. Instead, I will do X, Y, and Z.
So this is the inventory. You're just taking note. So in other words, it's a psychological inventory. Instead of taking an inventory of how the bottom line is working in your company, you just take note of where the hot buttons are for you and
what you're getting or what you're missing.
Yeah.
And then what do I have? The first thing you can usually do then is, it's a sequence. There's the behavior, then there's the mind program, then there's the perception, and then there's the stimulus. So you start backwards. You start out noticing first the behavior I don't want. Now, I can control the behavior, but I may not know where it's coming from. But I control the behavior, and then if I substitute something else, whatever the behavior was doing gets left undone, and I may feel the fear, the anger, that whatever it is.
based on your experience, would most executives be able to, once having made this inventory, be able to self-correct?
The average executive who's basically just learning new skills, that's no problem. He can figure out, I'm handling my staff meeting wrong. The way I'm reacting to suggestions is turning people off. And I do it because I'm impatient. Okay, I end up saying one of the things you need to do is be less impatient. Now you don't even know you're impatient. So now you have to start becoming aware of when you're getting impatient. Start noticing, what do they do that makes you impatient? Well, it's whenever they're doubting my word. Oh, well, okay. Now you start watching for whenever that's happening, and you stop the impatience.
So having a consultant wouldn't be a bad idea either, to help you take inventory of what is going on.
Actually, for the most part, you need a helper, a trainer, a counselor, or an outside agent. It's very hard to see into through your own defenses. You need somebody to get you data. If you're offending people, they won't tell you. Somebody else, they'll tell somebody else, and you can get the data. When you're starting to change your personality at any depth, you need a mirror. You need a helper.
Part of this process, as part of this process, you have written that you need to take responsibility for what is going on. I would think that would be self-evident, but then there must be people who are not taking responsibility.
No, being responsible in that case means that I don't let my automatic tapes run me. I choose. So my urge is to be angry, but I am responsible for my behavior. So in spite of the anger, that's what I mean by responsible in that case. When you automate and go on automatic pilot, you've stopped being responsible for what comes out. You're leaving it to the program. Being responsible means that I take back responsibility for the program.
And so let's say you do have a counselor or coach, or you're doing it on your own.
And incidentally, let me interrupt.
Sure.
That counselor or coach can be a coworker where you say, hey, anytime you see me doing this, will you call it to my attention? That's someone outside helping you. When you see me doing that which upsets people, would you let me know?
Would you suggest that all leaders or all prospective leaders do one of these self-inventories?
I would suggest that all leaders be trained in self-awareness techniques, and that they be trained in understanding their own personality, their own makeups, their own defenses, and how to manage them.
If you are a young prospective leader, a rising leader, the sooner you get onto this, the better off you would be, I presume?
If I were a young leader and knew that's what I wanted for my career, I would wish to dickens there was an ML program in leadership where I could go study all of that kind of, all of the psychology of leadership, the processes of leadership, and the personal leader self elements of being a leader.
ML, master leader?
I just made it up. Yeah.
Okay.
There isn't one, but I would like to see one.
And without that, then the next best thing is to go to where?
Well, the next best thing, if you get aware that there's unawareness and you need to be aware of it, you can just make it a policy that you always go ask for feedback. You make it a habit. Wherever you are, you get feedback. Wherever there's a chance, you get some of this training. When you're doing performance appraisals, you spend as much time finding out how they see you as you do telling them where they are.
Suppose you are on this path of improving yourself, changing the way you operate, but you get resistance. resistance either from above, from those, or down from below, from the followers. What do you do in that case?
Though it depends what you mean by resistance.
Well, let's say you want to stop playing a certain game that you've been playing with the boss, and the boss...
What happens there, for example, if the boss has a game, the boss needs you to play your side of the game. Remember, if you've got a game, you have to play it because that's how you're keeping your internals together. So if the boss hired you because you do a good job of playing the other side of his game, and you stop playing the game, you're leaving him hanging high and dry. And if he puts out a game cue and you don't respond, he'll put out a game cue because he needs his fix.
So it's another kind of taking responsibility.
If taking responsibility, if I'm going to work with this situation with that kind of boss who does that kind of things, I'm going to be responsible not to act my side of it like an ass.
So you're not running on automatic, you're choosing.
At that point. It still may make me very upset when he does what he does, but I won't act it out. I'll just...
Now let's say you're, let's say you've been a leader who's been rather dictatorial, and you recognize that you've been dictatorial, and you're trying now to be a lot more reasonable in the way in which you deal with your followers, but they're scared to death because they don't understand what the heck is going on here because suddenly you've changed. What do you do in those kinds of circumstances?
Well, that gets into technology again. I would teach such a leader, hey, they have mindsets and expectations of the way you are. If you start changing in the face of those mindsets, they're going to act out of those mindsets. Why don't you have a development session with your people and tell them you've learned that you're over-controlling and too dominating and you think that's not good leadership and you've decided to change it because you want to give them more space to grow, and I would like you to engage in this process with me, and if you catch me being too... and so forth. In short, give them the mindset of being in on the change process.
You know what you're telling me is, Jim, or at least what I'm hearing, is that you can't change yourself in a vacuum.
Not unless you exist in a vacuum, and I don't know anybody who does.
But there's this tendency to think, I mean, you see the self-help books all over the place. You do this, you can do that, and you can become this or that or the other. Well, but what you're saying is you can't do this in isolation because there are these games, there are these interconnections that you have got to deal with.
Yes, but you can still change you. You know, if you become if you meditate regularly, you're going to change you. If you keep it up for 2, 3, 4 years, you're going to change.
Now, this is the second time.
No matter what's around, you will change.
Now, this is the second time in the course of these conversations you brought up the power of meditation. Elaborate as to why that holds so much fascination.
Meditation is 2 things. For one thing, it's practice. Well, it's 3 things. Most of us get stuck in our thinking brains, and all of our universe is a function of us running our tapes and listening to our dumb mind, which is not really us and not alive. And in order to become enlightened, you have to get free of your mind, and you have to get to the point where you make up your mind instead of having your mind make you up. You have to get into your being, or however you want to put it, so that you make up your mind instead of the other way around. Now, if your mind is thinking all the time, that's all you're listening to, then you're stuck in your mind. Meditation, one of the first things you do is you begin to practice not thinking. Well, if you're not thinking, what are you going to be aware of? All of the stuff you've been missing while you listen to your dumb thoughts and your repetitive thoughts. You begin to feel and hear and all sorts of... That's one part of meditation. Now, doing that and watching your mind, you begin to see your games. You begin to see the foolish beliefs. You begin to see what you're afraid of. You begin to see how you make yourself tense. Every time you do that, you can start changing and moving into a centered, calmer thing. Now, the other part about meditation is if you meditate and go away, go deeper, you can go down into your deeper self, into your, they call it the void or whatever, down into your being, into your consciousness. And at that point, you know, you can read about it. They say you can't talk about it. You become one with the universe, and you lose your body. And
well, now, this isn't a meditation course, but I have to ask you some practical questions. How often does one need to meditate, at least to be making some progress.
If you really want to use it, you do it a half hour in the morning or a half hour at night just before you go to bed.
May I ask
Do
you,
wonders.
I don't mean to be personal here, but do you, you must do this then?
Yes, but more than that. Some master said once, anybody can meditate in a chapel. It takes a master to meditate in the marketplace. In short, right now I am meditating. I'm sitting here watching me do this interview with you. That's a form, a level of meditation.
And what is that giving you
well, for
that
one,
you wouldn't get otherwise?
well, for one thing, I keep watching what my mind is saying to do and deciding whether I want to or not. And I also notice if I start slumping and all sorts of things. That if I were just lost in my mind, I'd get in the argument with you. And
The implication of what you're saying from a couple comments a minute ago is that meditation, therefore, is something that you could call upon when you're in one of those tense, anxious, angry moments where you don't quite know what else to do.
I recommend it all the time. As a matter of fact, the way when I started going through, you know, up 25 years ago, I was a very unaware character, or whatever it was. As I started on this road, and I'd noticed that for instance, I tended to use anger in my supervision and decided this was crazy and I wanted to stop it. So I'd get out there, the anger would come, I'd go to my office, I would sit down, and I would have my anger. I'd just sit and observe it, watch it, see how I felt, what I thought, what it told me to do, and I'd say, boy, that's dumb. Anyhow, within 10, 15 minutes, I'd be calm, and then I'd go out and see him. And of course, when I did that, I found out I would get fear. So then I had to go sit and have the fear anyhow.
And so let me stick with that a minute, because this is a very common thing for all of us as human beings. So when you first went and you were angry and you meditated and it went away, was it immediately followed by the fear, or was it later that you...
No, the anger would go away, and I'd go out to start doing what I'm dealing with the problem, and I would find that I was coming from fear that it was going to go wrong, fear that he wouldn't, fear that, you know, this was all happening in my life game where it was very important to me that this work. I could starve to death. And I was dealing with anger, let's fix this. When I didn't do that, I'm sitting there saying, hey, we could blow this whole thing. I could go broke here.
And how long did it take you?
A couple of years.
How long before you started noticing significant improvement?
A month, right away. I stopped using anger right away. The fear, that took a few months. And after a while, you see, if you meditate, what you find out is that fear is nothing but a little tightness in the stomach. All the rest of it we add in with our programs up here.
I've heard you say that it's the fear of the fear that so limits people in what they will tackle in their lives.
Well, that's another thing. We teach people not to have fear, so they get afraid of having fear. Actually, you'd be very glad you've got fear if it's giving you a warning. But it's very awful to have fear if it's constantly putting you into wanting to run away. And that's what we do. We have a constant thought. Nobody likes me. So every time I'm around a person, I get fear. Or you give me an assignment. I think I'm stupid. Every time you give me an assignment, I get fear. And the whole, the mind creates, you know, I took up kayaking a few years ago. And you know, in whitewater kayaking, you can, and I noticed that sometime driving up there, I got a 5-hour drive, thinking about getting on that river, and I get a fear down here. I called it anxiety. The minute I got on the river, it would disappear. But the thought kept triggering fear, fear, fear. Well, that's what we do in our life generally when we're out of control.
And to repeat again what you have said earlier, the key there is to stand back, look at it, think about it, notice that it is there, don't act on it in either direction, and get into the habit of just letting it pass.
And the way you don't act on it is, now that I know that happens, is when it comes up, let it be there, have it, say, hello, fear. Nope. It's nothing but a physical thing down here unless I mentalize it. So now I notice an unconscious thing, triggered a fear, there it is, I look around and say, this is nonsense, I say thanks, No, I'm not going to obey you.
Again, you choose the behaviors you want to drop, the behaviors you want to adopt, begin monitoring the thoughts and actions that go with them, and alter them over time. Jim Farr has talked about the importance of knowing your followers. Next, he discusses how to read them as individuals and how to tackle some specific workplace problems.
If you've tried everything possible to make it work and it doesn't work, you didn't fail. You failed if you leave them on the job and mess it up. We need to organize leadership as a profession and get a code of ethics which says it is unethical and unacceptable to get followership by misleading followers. If you can't have what you want what you have. The point is, make yourself feel good. You're in charge.
Hello, I'm Rick Amey. Now that you as a leader understand yourself better, let us return to knowing better those who follow you. Leadership expert Jim Farr has already mentioned the technique he calls mapping the mental terrain, a method for reading people. You should read people well, to lead well, and to influence them. In our ongoing conversation at his place in rural North Carolina, Jim clarifies this and tackles some typical management problems, while reminding us that what we are thinking is fundamental to how to collaborate with others.
In the first place, if I'm going to read somebody, I have to have an idea where to look and what to look for. So one of the things as a good leader that I would do and that I do as a psychologist, I've got models. I've got a blueprint in my head as to how you tick. You know, my blueprint says you've got a conscious side, and you've got programs and meta programs, and you've got an unconscious side and negative ground, and you've got anxiety. I got a blueprint of this. So doing that, I know how to ask questions or watch for signs that you have high anxiety or low anxiety, or that you're blind to what you're saying here, or that this is an obsessive compulsive kind of thing you're doing. In short, one of the things I need to do is understand how that thing works. You know, I drive my car into the garage and he just listens to it and says, I think it's the, and all I hear is just a hum, because he knows how the engine works. Well, if you really want to read people, you need to know how the engine works.
And the advantage to you as the leader to read the people is
mapping the mental terrain so I can adapt my leadership to your motivational system. Also, if I'm hiring people, it's very handy to me to find out how you tick before I hire you. And
you know, there's something invasive about this idea of reading people. I don't know, it's a visceral reaction on my part. Knowing that you want to read me, it seems like you are trying to learn enough about me to manipulate me. Wouldn't that be a reasonable reaction?
Yes, leadership. Everybody, people in our culture.
So you would be manipulating. You would be.
People tend to think manipulate. Oh, I can't do that. You can't be here without manipulating me. The minute I walk in the room, I'm a stimulus, and I affect you. That's manipulation. If I say hi, I just manipulated you because you say hi back. Leadership is nothing but manipulate. All relationships are. You cannot avoid manipulating me or your followers, period. Therefore, and people get offended, you're teaching us manipulation. You know what? I would rather you manipulated me deliberately and consciously from a good moral position rather than blindly manipulate me without even knowing what you're doing. Because if I'm your subordinate, you're going to manipulate me. And I don't like you doing it blind.
How do I deal? I want to deal with some practical questions that arise for leaders. How do I deal with difficult employees who are good at what they do, but their personalities make them a problem?
Well, in the first place, it depends on whether they're motivated or whether they don't give a hoot. But if they do care, one of the first things you do is you have to give them feedback as to what you're experiencing and where you are about it, the effect it's having. Now, if they're a reasonably motivated person and you give them data that says this is causing difficulty, on the average, people tend to want to fix it. Now, if they're neurotic and gamey and you do it, you maybe just entered into a game. There isn't anything you can do about it. As a leader in that case, if you can't do anything about it, you may be remiss if you don't fire them. Your job is to make the situation work. And if you've got somebody that you've tried to get to stop doing or do what they're doing, and they refuse and it's disruptive, your job is to get rid of the disruption.
And how quick do you pull the trigger in those kind of circumstances?
Depends how good they are, how important they are, how replaceable they are, and how long you've been trying to get rid of. Practical matters get into that. If the person is very good and very essential and a real pain in the neck, but if you get rid of them, you're going to have to shut down for 3 days. I wouldn't get rid of them until I found a replacement and figure out some way to handle it.
Well, there are a couple of CEOs that I interviewed a number of years ago of some prominent companies in our area, and both of them more or less, getting to this issue of firing people, and both of them more or less said the same thing, that they considered the firing of an employee to be a failure on their part. That if somebody was causing them difficulty, a follower, it was either because A, they were in the wrong job, or B, they hadn't been adequately trained. Therefore, they, as CEOs, considered it a personal failure to have to fire somebody. I
say it's a personal failure to have to fire somebody if you haven't tried everything possible to make it work. If you've tried everything possible to make it work and it doesn't work, you didn't fail. You failed if you leave them on the job and mess it up.
And the test for that, again, then is the test for whether you've done enough?
Whether you're a good enough leader to go find out where they are, get them to listen to you, find out what their needs and map their mental terrain, and give them all the information that's essential and everything they need to in order to know the change is asked for and needed and how to do it. And then if they don't do it, you've done all you can do. You know, if you spend a few years as a therapist, you'll find out you can't change anybody unless they want to change, and if they don't want to change, give it up. If they don't want to change, there's nothing you can do.
And yet, I'm quite confident most leaders feel that they're doing something wrong because people aren't changing.
That's because in most cases they are doing something wrong, because most people are willing to change. What I just described is the unusual case. But most leaders really don't spend much time asking, have I done all I should to help these people grow? Have I heard where the... You know, I did an attitude survey recently where a whole lot of people, and there's a lot of questions on what do you think of management, and so forth. And the way that I score it is I find the percent of times that all the people, when they could have been positive, are negative. So I'll have what's called a negative index, which is 42, means 42% of all questions were answered negatively by these people. I saw in this 68% of all answers were negative about the company, and management didn't even know it. They hadn't done what they needed to do to find out what's with the people, what they needed, why they were doing what they were doing well or wrong. In those cases, those executives you talked about are correct. They're failures. That's inadequate leadership. Adequate leadership says that I'm your leader, you're my follower. My job is to get you to follow, to do what I need, and I'm going to do that in a manner which is most satisfying to you. You would only be willing to do it for me because there's something in it for you, or you wouldn't do it. And my job is to see that I'm doing everything possible to enable you to get everything you can gain from the situation of supporting me in my leadership. Now, if I've done that, I'm perfectly willing to fire you. Now, most leaders don't do that.
So therefore, there's a certain ambiguity into the firing because they don't really know enough information to be absolutely clear what they're doing.
Well, the way it is in our culture, I think that attitude those executives had is a good one. It kind of keeps them focused on you need to do more, you need to do more. Leaders are not doing enough, in my opinion, to support the followers they have. They need the money and there's too much control. I think we ought to have a principle in leaders and leadership that says if you have to fire them, you failed. Now, the fact will be that there's going to be an exception that a certain percent of them, God himself couldn't change those people, and all you can do is fire them. But meanwhile, you've tried your best in every case. And that's really what those people are saying.
So in other words, my premise, their premise is a good one. That
it's a useful
It's
one.
a useful one. Another leadership problem. Let me read it off my page here. I try to do everything at work myself. I don't delegate responsibilities as a leader as I should. What usually is the psychological underpinning for that failure to delegate, and what is the typical way of getting out of that fix?
It can be perfectionism. I got to be sure it's right. It can be lack of trust and understanding of subordinates. It can be that I'm a workaholic and I'm uncomfortable if I'm not out there hands-on doing it. Now, what's wrong with it, when it's not so extreme, it's that I let them do the body work, but I do all the thinking, all the deciding, and all of the figuring it out, and then they get to do the stuff. Well, that deprives them from all of the rewards and satisfactions of thinking and being creative. You know, Charles Handy said in one of his books, it is a sin to deprive people of their decision-making.
Oh, and yet that's all too common, I would presume, in the American marketplace.
So why they do it can be out of habit, it can be out of their own compulsions, out of distrust, or it's too much work to train them, or whatever. The effect of it is, overall, is a negative effect. It depreciates people.
Robs themselves of the creativity that they could be drawing upon from the people below them. And so a good solution to this would be, borrowing on what you've said in the past, would be to delegate, watch what happens with the emotions that come from that, and let them pass. And then learn to deal with it and get into the practice of dealing with the fear that comes with it.
The best leaders are...
Am I getting onto this?
Yes.
Okay, I just want
The
to be
best
sure.
leaders are those who take as their task facilitating the followers following. So I could end up just being the one who gives directional leadership and then sit back and ask everybody, okay, folks, how are we going to get there? And let them do it.
How do I motivate people? Say I've got good people, but I'm in a position where I can't promote them and I can't give them raises for reasons beyond my control. How do I motivate them?
In the first place, tell them the absolute facts, which are, hey, our finances are such that I can't pay more. I'd like to, but I can't. And there's no place to promote to. That's what this is. Now, let's do all we can to make it an enjoyable and a good place to work. But if it's important for you to be promoted, I can't help you. Tell them the truth.
Now, why would that motivate me as a follower to hear
It
that?
might motivate you to quit.
Well, that's exactly right.
Well, then the option is then don't tell them the truth, and they keep working on making an assumption that maybe they're going to get promoted when you know they can't. That's dishonest.
And I'm sure that's the more common path.
That's why I said we need to organize leadership as a profession and get a code of ethics which says it is unethical and unacceptable to get followership by misleading followers. You know,
But what if you're, let me stick with this a minute, because this feels to me like a common problem. So you as a middle manager are put in the position of managing people, and your budget limits you from promoting or paying them more money, and you're supposed to get more work out of them, and you're saying to tell them the truth and let the chips fall where they may.
Well, the options are to lie to them. Let them think that there's more money and more promotions when there aren't. I find that hard to support.
Should the leader,
Now, on the other hand,
should the leader be quitting, perhaps, because he can't,
that
he or she can't?
Depends on life and practicalities and so on. You know, if you're running a marginal business and it's a worthwhile business, but you don't have capital and you have a small share of the market and there's 200 people working there, and you can't compete with the big place down the road, but you're doing your best, it's okay to keep running. But how do you motivate them, you ask? You see, you're making the assumption you do it with the raises and the promotions.
Precisely.
The way there's many other ways to motivate. You go out and you give them more challenges. You give them the satisfaction of problem solving. You give them chances to learn new functions so that they're expanding their own career value. There's all kinds of other ways to motivate. And or if that's really the place you've got, go out and hire a group of people who are not motivated to get promoted and are satisfied to get what they can earn because they know they're not going any further. Don't overstaff, overqualify your staff.
What is your favorite way of disciplining employees?
I don't have to discipline very much, and I don't think you have.
I'm not talking about you and your organization, but in terms of what you advise.
The first thing is to tell them what's up. Tell them what they're doing and what they're doing they shouldn't do or not doing they should, and what you want and the consequences. That's the first thing. The next thing is, as I would say, and let them know what the consequences are if they do it again, if they keep doing it. And then if they do it, give them the consequences.
You're just simply talking about plain, straightforward communications.
What else is there?
Well, there's a lot more, I think.
People do what they want, and all I can do is go and say, the way you're doing that is not satisfactory, and if you want to work here, I don't want you to do that. But then I'd go on, how do you feel about that? And they may argue with me, and we get all done. I say, hey, I hear your arguments, but the fact is that's what we've decided. If you want to work here, you can't do it that way. Here's the way we want it. Now, how do you feel about that? And if he says, well, I'm going to do it my way anyhow, and I say, well, if you do, I don't think you'll be here very long, or whatever it happens to be.
Let's say I'm a mid-level manager. I've got a lot of creative ideas. I'm ambitious, but my superiors ignore me. What do I do?
Well, I would recommend first that you go talk to your superiors and ask them how you're doing and what the situation is, and tell them what your needs are and ask them what's up, what's possible. If they tell you to get back to your job, well, now you know where you are and decide whether you want to stay or not. If they say, hey, yeah, we'd like to help you, then talk with them about coming up with a plan and a procedure.
You make this sound so simple, Jim. But you know, in fact, in real life, it's so muddy. It is so gray out there.
It's so muddy because people behave muddily. If this person is that way, and that's what he wants, nothing's happening, what can he do? He can get a placard and march up and down in front of the building. All he can do is go to the source, to the power, and tell them where he is and what he wants and what he'd like. They will respond. And that's reality. You got a manager where when you go tell him, hey, this is what I'd like, and he says, go on back to the job if I need one, then that's a fact. What are you going to do with it?
Well, and then you go home and then you think about the fact that you've got a wife and 3 kids and she doesn't work and they all depend upon you and there's not but so many jobs in the marketplace, and so you keep the job and you're angry.
And then you need to get self-awareness training that says, what is, and if you've decided to stay there, you're stupid to be killing yourself with anger. If you've decided to stay there, like it. If you can't have what you want what you have. The point is, make yourself feel good. You're in charge. Now, if you can go someplace else and get your preferences, what you desire, go ahead. If you can't, you got a choice. Be miserable or be peaceful.
I'm thunderstruck by the degree to which, as you answer all these questions, and we keep coming back to the same thing. It is what we are saying to ourselves in our heads. It's not the circumstances in which we find ourselves, right?
Yep. In every circumstance, you have a choice as to how you're going to react.
If you can't have what you want what you have. You are in charge of your life and you control what you think. You must make choices. And if those choices cause fear and strong emotion, Jim Farr counsels that you get some self-awareness training to learn how to deal with it.